Black is a social construct. When I say that, people are like, what do you mean? But the truth is that, what it means to be Black here, it's so different if you go to other parts of the world, right? So I was always raised thinking that Black was really something that was permanent, but then, when you start thinking about it, you're like, wait a minute, like Black people look so different from one another, and then we're so different culturally from one another, we have different religions, like there's so much diversity in the Black community. So often what is holding us together is the fact that as an identity, it's been constructed in contrast to something else. So often like Black exists in contrast to white, which is also a social construct, which I'm sure it's gonna blow people's minds, but yeah, there's no such thing as white. It's been constructed in this society. And I've noticed that too because I always thought of myself as a very Black, and then when I started becoming more involved with the Sub-Saharan African community, they were like, they would always even question sometimes whether like I was Black or like how Black I was. Like they'd always be the first to be like, you're mixed with something. And so the more you actually start getting involved with other Black communities, and we're just like, okay. And then I have other friends who are mixed race too, because I'm mixed race, and they sometimes didn't look Black at all, but they were still Black because that's still their history. So again, you start realizing how like Black is more than just the pigment of your skin. It's a construct that exists here, because particularly if you look at the one drop rule in the United States, people who didn't even look Black were considered Black. So there's Black in terms of your descent is from Sub-Saharan Africa, how many years ago? And then there's Black in terms of how we say about Black culture, Black music, Black forms of Islam and Christianity, and all those things, like they're made up of Black people, but we have to be really critical of what we mean by that, because Black is not this essential thing. And often sometimes I think as Black people, we get trapped in thinking there's only one way to be Black, when the reality is if you actually unpiece it, that Black is a social contract. There's all sorts of ways you can be Black. And all it really comes down to is that you are descended from Sub-Saharan Africa. But again, if you go to another part of the world, Black might mean something completely different. If you go to Britain, they're referring to anyone who's not white as Black. So again, but in the North American, South American context, Black is that your ancestors came from Sub-Saharan Africa, and they had a lot of melanin in their skin. Empowerment to me is when you realize your own sense of agency. So agency is like, I understand that there are certain things I control in my life. There's not a lot of things I control, but there's things I control. Things are not just happening to me, and I'm just letting them happen. I'm not passive in my life. So if I'm empowered, I understand that I might be in a difficult situation, but I control how I react to it. And I think empowerment is incredibly important for individuals and communities, because oftentimes when we see things really going wrong when it comes to sort of cycles of poverty or of criminalization, it's often because communities don't have that sense of empowerment, that sense to determine their own future. And yes, there's a lot of things in this world that you cannot control, but you can control how you react to them. You can control whether you have a sense of hope, whether you have a sense of ownership, whether you have a sense of even responsibility. Like, I think empowerment does come down a lot to responsibility. You understand what parts of your life you're responsible for and what parts of your life, might be controlled by other people, but you really grab onto the parts of your life that you're responsible for, and you make that worth something. That's what empowerment means to me. Diaspora is it's an academic term, but I like to use it a lot, and it basically means that way in which so many communities have been they've left their country of origin, or their space of origin, and they've been scattered around the world like seeds. So you could talk about now the Somali diaspora. So there's regions in Africa where Somali people came from, but now they're in the Netherlands and Australia and Canada, and they've been scattered everywhere like seeds. And the same thing goes for Black. When we say the Black diaspora, it means, again, communities originating in Sub-Saharan Africa that have been spread around the world, sometimes by choice through immigration, but more often than not by the systems of slavery, where they were shipped across the Atlantic, across the Sahara, across the Indian Ocean, to countries as far afield as South Asia, where you still have communities in India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka that are descended from Africans who came there, and they're part of the Black diaspora. Imperialism, I mean, people have written so many books about this, so I'm sure I'm going to give it a definition that people will be like, that's not true. But imperialism has everything to do with the word empire, right? So it's one thing to be having a country and then you sort of rule that country. It's when you sort of go outside your state and you start ruling other states, other lands. So for example, in Muslim history, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, it actually spread, as far afield as from Morocco to other parts of the Middle East, when it originated in what would now be considered Turkey, and that's an empire. So and the problem often with empires is that they also often go along with colonialism. So you have people from the state of origin settle and control the regions that they have taken over, and often the people who originally, like the indigenous inhabitants or the original inhabitants of those regions, are disempowered and often lack a lot of political power and often aren't in a position to have political office. And often the problem that also happens with empires is that, say for example, you've been taken over by an empire and you have a natural resource that might have enriched your country. Now that natural resource is used to enrich that empire. So you might have your natural resource that used to be used to take care of your own people is now being taken and shipped all the way somewhere else. And so often we talked about the British Empire, which is one of the largest empires in the world, and we've seen how a lot of that empires was not only about taking over land and settling people, it was also about trade and controlling natural resources. So that was the same in terms of the Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire in South Asia, and many other empires that have existed. Because again, empires can exist on what we see as relatively small scales, but they were still often acting that way. It became the interests of an indigenous population became subjugated to another ruling population that often came up with a whole bunch of reasons why they could justify taking over. So whether that be because their ethnic group was superior, because they had a superior civilization, because they had a superior religion, all those reasons would usually be used to justify why they had a right to take over your land. So we see the legacy of racism with the British Empire, but there's other legacies we can see with other empires that are still living with us today in terms of maybe religious oppression or ethnic conflict, because one community came in and said that they were better suited than another community to have power. History for me is about stories. It's interesting, in the French it's histoire, and histoire means story. It can also mean a story. So history is our stories, the stories of our past, and our past doesn't have to be that long ago. Our past is like, yesterday, really. But it's the stories that, help us understand how we got to where we are. So you can have a history of a community in Canada, you can have a history of Canada, you can have a history of the world. I mean, there's so many stories you can tell. And the thing about history is that a lot of it history can be manipulated in so many ways. There's so many ways to tell a story, and I think that's why history should be seen as a story. There are certain facts, but there are also a lot of things that are up to interpretation. And so it's always important to be critical when you're looking at history. If somebody tells you, like, I know the history of something, always be critical and always, try to find out things for yourself, because history is just a story and it can be spun in many different ways.